Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny.
What's good, Dutch here, getting real silly. Going apeshit on this game, about to pull a millie. Your goofy ass is such a silly nanny. Acting so foolish, you ain't got a planny. Looking so ridiculous, just like Scooby-Doo. No girl would waste they Scooby snacks on you. Going outside in the sun, getting tanny. Then I'm headed to Bob Saget's, cause he's a silly nanny.
Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny.
Yo, Quell on the mic just like a nanny. I'm so blacked out, I'm acting insane. I got this girl and she's taking off her panties, going down low and she's sucking on my candy. She loves my ice, it's fucking uncanny. Looking so good, only caring about my manny. What you looking at? You look like a granny. Drop you so hard, you sitting on your fanny.
Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny.
I'm walking around just turning on my swag. When I see your face, it makes me wanna gag. I was with your girl last night at drinking Pete's. It wasn't long before in that bitch I had to ski. When I see you, I think of a nanny. So goofy like an elf with his candy, swinging for the fences like Russell Brand. Then I'm going to Fleming's, cause he's a silly nanny.
Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny.
Quell back on the mic cause I own this landy. Known from here all the way back to Japan. Hanging in the club making girls so randy. I take one home, she'd say her name is Mandy. Rapping so good they trying to ban me. Quit looking at me, you look like a tranny. Quell is out cause I'm about to claim a Grammy. I'll see you later, you fucking silly nanny.
Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Who's a silly nanny? Use a silly nanny. Ow, bitch!
Mike will bait.
Yo, that's Quell and Bones beat.
Dutch on the mic.